What is jihad? How does the Quran employ the word? How did Islam spread? Define jizya. How is the word jihad used in the Middle Ages and in modernity? What is takfir? In both the ancient world and today, non-Muslims have critiqued Islam for being particularly intertwined with violence. From Muhammad's battles to the spread of Islam supposedly by the sword, to the counter-crusades in the Middle Ages, and to militant movements today. So it seems in order to trace Islamic conceptions of violence from Islamic origins in late antiquity to the present, and see if there are patterns or not. It would be most helpful to give a genealogy of the word jihad. We're going to take this 7th century Arabic term, jihad, and trace it forward through history to see how different Muslims have employed it at different moments in time. On the ground level, the word jihad just means struggle or striving, doing something difficult for some beneficial end. On the most literal level, it has nothing explicitly to do with violence, just doing something that requires a great deal of effort. However, implicitly, the term jihad very often implies violence, since, after all, fighting people is in fact a difficult thing to do. That isn't to say that jihad always refers to violence, it does not, but that is certainly a common interpretation of the term. So let's start with how the Quran employs the term jihad. The Quran appears in a tribal world, and living is rough. And so the Quran is what tribal culture always is: practical. You make alliances when you can, even with your enemies. You struggle together when you can, despite your differences. You fight when you have to, but that's not the ideal. The term jihad doesn't appear in the Meccan Quran, when Muhammad was still based in his hometown. Although Muhammad and his people were clearly under attack from their own tribe, the Quraysh, there's no clear command from the Quran to respond to this with violence. When jihad does appear, it's after the Hijrah, when Muhammad and his Ummah are in Medina. Now remember that in Medina, Muhammad was the intertribal arbitrator of many different groups. There were his immediate followers, the Muhajirun, or the refugees, the immigrants, that is, members of the Quraysh tribe who fled their ancestral home in Mecca along with Muhammad himself. But the majority of people in the Ummah would have been the natives of Yathrib or Medina, or referred to as the Ansar, the helpers. This group would have been people from several different religious communities and at least 12 different tribes, maybe more. We know at least 9 of these tribes were Jewish, or were at least a majority Jewish, and they're addressed throughout the Medinan Quran, even at the end of Muhammad's life, as when the Quran says, "O you Jewish people," we know there must be a lot of Jewish people in the audience. We also know that some Christians were in Medina too, since the Quran often addresses them likewise with lines like, "O you Christians." What we never see in the Quran, though, is the audience addressed as, "O you Muslims." While there are clearly at least some people in Muhammad's Ummah who called themselves submitters, Muslims, it probably was not the norm to self-identify in that way until long after the life of the Prophet. Granted, the Ummah were people who presumably believed that Muhammad was a prophet, and they were monotheists, but they probably just didn't self-identify with a particular word, Muslim. And so it follows that the Quran never addresses violence against all Jews or all Christians as enemies of the Ummah, as most of the people in the Ummah would have still thought of themselves as Jews and Christians. Take a look at this passage that we met before. This is chronologically the first time the Quran gives people the right to fight. Permission is given to those who fight because evil has been done to them, and surely God is indeed able to help them. These are those who have been expelled from their homes without any right, only because they said, "Our Lord is God." But if God had not repelled some people by means of others, many monasteries, churches, synagogues, and mosques in which the name of God is mentioned often would indeed have been destroyed. So there are two reasons one is allowed to fight. Either because you're a persecuted monotheist, or because you are a refugee who's been wrongfully forced from your home. So what the Quran isn't saying here is that you Muslims are just like the Jews and Christians in the past because you have to fight too. It's saying Jews, Christians, and believers in the one God are allowed to fight, because most of the people hearing this passage, when it was first recited, were themselves Jews and Christians. So the Quran would never say, attack all the Jews or attack all the Christians, because most of the people that the Quran is commanding to fight here are themselves Jews or Christians. On the other side of this fight are the Quraysh, most of whom probably would be people that we would call today pagans, that is, associators, mushrikun. But allied with the Quraysh, and possibly amongst them, were other groups of Jews and Christians. Here we have to do some more guesswork since the Quran is addressing the Ummah, not their enemies. So who exactly the associators entails is a little foggy. But later historical records, such as the Sirah, mention that there are at least two Jewish tribes that allied themselves with the Quraysh. But interestingly and importantly, the Quran never says that Jews and Christians are themselves associators. Sure, the Quran critiques certain aspects of Judaism and Christianity as like association, but it never just declares them as associators or non-believers. The Quran is reforming what it sees as problems with Judaism and Christianity, but it certainly does not try to demonize them wholesale. So the Quran never says, kill Jews because they're Jews, or fight Christians because they're Christians. And it wouldn't, because the very people being commanded to fight and kill are mostly Jews and Christians themselves. But the Quran does mention killing associators. Check out this passage, often referred to as ISUII025, the sword verse. Give those who disbelieve news of a painful punishment. Except those of the associators with whom you have made a treaty, since they've not failed you in anything and they've not supported anyone against you. Fulfill their treaty with them until their term is up. Surely God loves those who restrain themselves. Then, when the sacred months have passed, kill the associators wherever you find them, and seize them and besiege them, and sit and wait for them at every place of ambush. If they turn sides, observe prayer and give alms, let them go on their way. Surely God is forgiving, compassionate. Yes, the Quran is clear that there are times when one is permitted to fight. But this verse is hardly arguing for genocide or for individual actors to commit random violence. In fact, it isn't even talking about a universal principle of fighting. It's talking about a particular situation in which a particular treaty, the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, had been violated by certain groups. But even if we ignore that, and read this passage out of its original historical context, the Quran still isn't telling anyone to start killing random people. It's saying that there are pagans, associators, and you can, and presumably should, make peace treaties with them. And if the pagans honor their side of the treaty, you honor it too. So, you can kill people that are associators, but not because they're associators. Peace is preferable. The problem arises because of this sensational language. If you ignore the surrounding passages about treaties and forgiveness, and switch out the word associators or pagans with just non-Muslims, it appears to say, kill all the non-Muslims everywhere. But remember, this passage is addressed to a community living under siege. At this point in Muhammad's life, they've been under attack for about 8 years, so it shouldn't be that surprising that it's using forceful language. This is a call to arms, but it's not a call to annihilation. How did this little tribal ummah, which probably only consisted of a few thousand people, turn into the Umayyad Empire, who, within a century of Muhammad's death, directly or indirectly controlled land from the Chinese interior to Spain? An Arabian tribal monotheistic revival movement from the middle of nowhere would, at lightning speed, become an empire bigger than Rome ever was. This is the period of the Rashidun and Umayyad caliphates, usually just referred to as the Arab conquests. It's both controversial and hard to plot historically. It's controversial because it seems to play into the notion that Islam is especially bloodthirsty and bent on world domination. And it is tempting to reduce the struggle of the Ummah against the Quraysh, the Quran's jihad, into these conquests a generation or two later. And at the same time, we have surprisingly little historical data on this period to work with, meaning that people are free to explain the rapid spread of Islam however they see fit, without having to be corrected by facts. No record from the time, from anywhere, explains the Arab conquests as being about religion or theology. As far as we can tell, there were no mass conversions or even attempts at them. And neither are there any records from the time of Arabic speakers referring to these conquests as jihad. Maybe they did, but we have no evidence of it. So visions you may have of Arabs wielding scimitars telling people to convert to Islam or die was simply not happening, and no eyewitness record from the time even claims that it was. That's all folktale that was written later. Now, there was warfare involved in the Arab conquests, but it's much more complicated than one would think. Just to show you, here are 2 eyewitness records from the time written by non-Muslims. These are both people who lived through the Arab conquests. The first is from ISUIII III, the head of the Church of the East. That's a rival Christian church to the imperial Byzantine Christianity. He's writing around the year 640. As for the Arabs, to whom God has at this time given rule over the world, you know well how they act towards us. Not only do they not oppose Christianity, but they praise our faith, honor the priests and saints of our Lord, and give aid to the churches and monasteries. And here's another one. This is Rabbi Simon ben Yochai, who claims to have had a vision in which he saw the Ishmaelites, that is, the Arabs, coming to the rescue of Jews against the Roman Byzantines. He's writing around the year 670. Rabbi Simon saw the kingdom of Ishmael, that is, the Arabs, was coming, and he began to say, "Was it not enough what the wicked kingdom of Edom, that is, Rome, had done to us?" But then an angel tells him, "Do not fear, Son of Man, for the Almighty only brings the kingdom of Ishmael to deliver you from the wicked. He raises over them a prophet, and a great dread will come between them and the Romans. They are a salvation for Israel." Notice that both of these records view the Arab conquests as positive developments, even though neither author is himself a Muslim. And funny enough, neither ever uses the term Islam or Muslim to explain what's going on. They do know that something's going on with the Arab tribes, and Rabbi Simon knows specifically that they claim to have a prophet in their midst. But neither one of them frames the Arab conquest as Islamic. Why? Because for nearly everyone, there was no such a thing as Islam, including for many of these Arab conquerors themselves. The Arabs saw themselves as part of a tribal alliance, many or most of whose members were Jews or Christians, even still after Muhammad. Outside of the Quran, the label Islam or Muslim was rare for about a century, and of course even the Quran doesn't use the words Muslim or Islam that much. And more interestingly, and bizarrely, we have next to no noteworthy archaeological data of the Arab conquests. And that, as we say, is crazy. When a battle's fought, there are huge amounts of remains left behind. Bodies, pieces of metal weapons, encampment remains, carbon left from fire and sieges, leveled cities, ruined barricades. But from the Arab conquests, which supposedly involved about a dozen major battles between multiple empires, we don't see any of that. No piles of bones, weapons, or burned down cities. But later history books, and many still being written, both by Muslims and non-Muslims, talk about this sudden explosion of Islam out of Arabia as a known fact. But it's anything but. How was it that suddenly, within a century of Muhammad, there were Arabs everywhere, a few of whom would have had some notion called Islam, who crushed the Persian Empire, neutered the Byzantines, and managed to do it all without leaving massive amounts of archaeological remains? Well, we have to do some guesswork here. First off, the same old problems of Arabian geography remain. The desert cannot support large populations. Of course, the trade routes are still in effect, but caravan raids, which people had used forever as a ways to get what you need to survive in desperate times, were no longer useful. By the end of Muhammad's life, nearly everyone in Arabia was part of the Ummah or was the Ummah's ally. So there were fewer and fewer Arab groups to raid without the Ummah attacking itself. So the caravan raids between the Arabian tribes transformed into raids on non-Arabians, the empires of Persia and Byzantium. They were richer and had better stuff anyway. Second, Jewish groups and anti-imperial Christians in both the Persian and Byzantine empires were very unhappy with their respective rulers even before the Arabs arrived. So they could just turn their cities over to the Arab caliphs, who would leave these people to their own devices in exchange for paying taxes, called the jizya. Basically, the jizya was just a non-Muslim version of the zakat. Since Muslims were required to give charity, non-Muslims paid the jizya. The jizya, or the poll tax, by an Islamic ruler on a non-Muslim, could be given at any rate the ruler decided to charge. Remember, there's no schools of fiqh yet. And so, if you were a Muslim governor and you had like a half a brain cell, you would just set the jizya lower than the Roman and Persian imperial taxes, and people would happily take your side. Third, the Arabs arrived on the world stage at the perfect moment. In the West, North Africa, and Spain, the fall of the Western Roman Empire was still lingering on. There was no emperor, the Pope had little power, and the local monarchies were constantly fighting each other. In the East, Byzantium and Persia had been warring for centuries. Both empires had been weakened due to constant shifts in borders and the cash drain of all the fighting. So the Middle East and North Africa were already quite unstable. For example, imagine you were living in Jerusalem when the Arabs arrived, and say you were 40 years old. You would have been born under Byzantine rule. Then the local Jews revolted against the Byzantines in the year 610. And then the Persians invaded in the year 614. And then the Christians revolted against the Persians in 617. And then the Byzantines reinvaded and took the city back in 629. By the time the first Arabs showed up in the year 637, someone living in Jerusalem would have lived through 3 different imperial rulers, 2 invasions, and 2 major revolts. Few Jerusalemites would have had deep-seated allegiances to either imperial government, Persian or Byzantine. And then, look, some people show up and they offer you more religious freedom than you have now and a better tax rate. Fourth, there would have been, for many people, some personal religious component to all this too. But this part of the process, what we call Islamization, would have been much slower. No one really changes religion in a day, even by force. It's a slow period of reflecting and reconsidering your practices and belief, usually taking place over a lifetime, if not several generations. Imagine that you're a Christian living in North Africa under Byzantine rule. You probably won't agree with the official Byzantine form of Christianity. Not only do you not like that some foreign emperor and his bishops are telling you what to think, their notion of the Trinity is confusing, and all their books are in Greek. And now, the Arabs come along, and they're not really that interested in enforcing a state religion on you. And besides, even if they were, the biblical God is still there, and so you like that. They affirm that Jesus is the Messiah, you do too. But these Arabs aren't interested in Trinitarianism or promoting written texts in foreign languages. In fact, the new Arab quote-unquote conquerors seem more than willing to just let you live your life. How did we come to see these periods of the Arab conquests as the spread of Islam by the sword? The histories of the Arab conquests, all of which were written long after the fact, paint with huge brushes. Even the earliest proper histories of the time are from centuries later, and by then, the historians would only understand the past in the most simplistic ways. If you were a Muslim historian, you would see the Arab conquests as jihad, a struggle on the path of God. It was an obvious continuation of the story of Muhammad. Just as Muhammad had fought to save the people of Medina, so too had the generations coming immediately after him fought the jihad to save and strengthen the Ummah. And conversely, the Christian historians living outside of the caliphates would write history the other way around. They would say that Islam was demonic, a violent ideology which overthrew the imperial order inaugurated by Christ himself. And so, if people were converting to this new religion called Islam, they must have been doing it at sword point. I mean, why else would they, right? Now, we have the various Islamic empires that existed since colonialism began. How did they invoke jihad? In this case, we have books and hard records. We have evidence of people using the term jihad and explaining how they thought it worked. In the Middle Ages, the term jihad was employed to describe the actions of an official Muslim government and a standing army. A jihad was a political move. If a caliph or a sultan went to war for whatever reason, they could explain it as jihad. They didn't always, but they could. Normally, jihad would carry with it a similar sense to the Christian notion of missionary work. You would fight a people and subdue them, and then, in time, people would gradually turn to your point of view. In this case, Islamize. Or they would remain non-Muslim but pay the jizya. Either way, like Christian missionaries or colonial invasions, the final goal was not to kill everyone, but to bring them into the fold, one way or another. Now, if you look at the fatwas, law books, and history books written by Muslims, it seems that people often converted to Islam en masse following a jihad, but this isn't reality. Just because some ruler declared a certain war a struggle or jihad on the path of God doesn't mean that it wasn't just a war like any other. And besides, expecting anyone to convert instantaneously at sword point isn't realistic. The more typical situation would instead play out like this. And by the way, this is roughly how Islam spread into the Indian subcontinent. A Muslim ruler would go to war with whoever for whatever reason. It could be with Muslims or with non-Muslims. And if the Islamic ruler wanted to justify their conflict using Islam, they could and call this war a jihad. They didn't have to, and they didn't always, but they could. So, did this jihad actually aid in the spread of Islam? Sort of, but it wasn't so straightforward. If the Muslim ruler that we're talking about here wins their war, they would set up their own institutions of power over the coming years. First, courts and then garrison towns, followed eventually by mosques, universities, and so on. More contact would be made between these two peoples who now live under the same one Islamic ruler. So more trade, more interreligious discussion, and more incentive to know about Islam. Charismatic Sufi sheikhs would prove particularly useful here. If slaves were taken from the initial battle, they would end up working in Muslim homes. Middle Eastern slavery, unlike American slavery, was almost always domestic. And so again, the subjugated people would be surrounded by Muslims, as would their children. Now, if they were urged to convert to Islam too forcefully, or the jizya, the non-Muslim poll tax, was set too high, well then, people would just convert to Islam to make their lives easier or their taxes lower. So one way or another, this is a very slow process of Islamization, and usually jihads weren't as deliberately about the spread of Islam as the history books claim they are. For instance, when Saladin expelled the Crusaders from Jerusalem in 1187, he claimed that his war efforts were jihad. Was he trying to convert the Crusaders to Islam? Not really. Was he trying to kill every Western Christian on earth? No. And that takes us into the modern period, the colonial and post-colonial world. Now, there are two ways the word jihad is invoked. In both senses, though, jihad has lost the medieval notion of war for the sake of conversion. The much more common way modern Muslims discuss jihad reverts back to its more ancient meaning of doing anything difficult for a noble end, a struggle. Since there's no need to spread Islam militarily anymore, everyone on earth at least knows about Islam's existence, and so a jihad in the military sense would be worthless anyway, Muslims instead refer back to a non-canonical hadith that appeared in the 11th century. In this hadith, Muhammad is talking to some of his companions after a battle. When they got home, their prophet is reported to have said, "We have returned from the lesser jihad to the greater jihad." When asked, "What is the greater jihad?" Muhammad replied, "It is the jihad against one's self." In other words, the jihad, the struggle, refers to the struggle to do anything to better yourself. Popular in Sufi circles and amongst Muslim modernists, this interpretation of jihad refers to the larger effort of a Muslim to do good, to study, to fight pollution, to promote justice. Any difficult act that one must do to be a better Muslim and make the world a better place is jihad. And if you were to ask the overwhelming majority of Muslims on earth today what jihad meant, this is the kind of explanation you'd probably receive. Perhaps with some caveat that it may in some cases involve defensive warfare. Far less typical, but much more striking, is the second modern interpretation of jihad as anti-colonial warfare. Again, the medieval notion of conversion is either absent altogether or is peripheral. Anti-colonial warfare as jihad also has quite a number of other differences from medieval, late antique, and Quranic notions of fighting. Unlike pre-modern jihad, anti-colonial warfare as jihad completely disregards systematic Islamic thought, like fiqh and tafsir. So, many activities that classical scholars would call haram, forbidden, are employed, like the use of fire, and hence explosives, or fighting non-combatants, including women and children. Similarly, traditional Islamic notions of authority are completely flouted. Whereas a medieval jihad must be declared by a ruler, typically a caliph, a modern jihadi is usually fighting outside of the authority of a standing Islamic government. Only a modern Muslim can declare a violent jihad on behalf of themselves. The use of suicide is also a development almost entirely unique to these anti-colonial versions of jihad, as the Quran and numerous hadith are clear that suicide is forbidden. While there are cases of, for instance, Kharijites more or less courting their deaths by jihad, actually deliberately killing yourself on purpose is otherwise unheard of before the modern period. Also, because many of the victims of this warfare are other people who also call themselves Muslims, the anti-modern colonial jihadi must claim to have the ability to declare other people to be non-Muslims. This is called takfir, making someone a non-Muslim. Basically, it means that someone is claiming that someone else isn't really a Muslim, no matter what they say. So therefore, they must be traitors to the Ummah, and they can be fought as threats. All living madhabs forbid this practice for the same reason. Only God can see what's in one's heart. If someone calls himself a Muslim, you have to believe them. But groups such as Al-Qaeda and ISIS regularly justify their violence by takfir. Jahiliyyah, the time of ignorance before the rise of Islam, is also here again. But now, rather than Jahiliyyah referring to some time in the past, Jahiliyyah refers to the state in which there is ignorance everywhere. That is, the world is still full of associators, only now they call themselves Muslims. While most forms of anti-colonial militancy as jihad are dismissed today as terrorism, extremism, and so forth, we have to also remember that there are Muslim actors who are claiming to fight violent jihad for lots of reasons beyond mere terrorism. Muslims in the subcontinent who tried to repel British colonizers often invoked notions of jihad in the early 20th century. Muslims in Algeria did the same with the French during their war for independence from 1954 to 1962. And West African Muslims who fought against the armies of enslavement, both the armies of the Western colonizers and those of other Muslims, called their struggle against the institution of slavery a jihad. What is jihad? How does the Quran employ the word? How did Islam spread? Define jizya. How is the word jihad used in the Middle Ages and in modernity? What is takfir?